In the heart of Tanzania's Serengeti Reserve, a vast and unforgiving stretch of golden plains and scattered acacia trees, lived an elderly man named Makonde. He was not just a man, he was a symbol. A former wildlife ranger who had dedicated more than half a century of his life to these lands, Makonde had grown from a young scout into a guardian of nature. Over 50 years, he stood between countless wild animals and the dangers of poaching, deforestation, and neglect. People across the reserve whispered his name with reverence, not out of fear, but out of deep respect. To many, he wasn't just a man of the bush. He was part of the Serengeti itself. Even after his official retirement, Makonde could never bring himself to truly leave. His bones ached, his breath grew shorter with the years, but his resolve remained firm as ever. Every dawn, before the sun had fully risen over the horizon and bathed the grasslands in fire-orange light, Makonde would climb into his old, dented Land Rover, a vehicle almost as legendary as he was. The engine roared to life with a stubborn cough, but it always took him where he needed to go. More than any other creature, Makonde had a deep bond with the elephants. Towering, majestic beings that roamed the reserve in small herds, the elephants held a wisdom that mirrored his own. He had watched many of them grow from calves into proud matriarchs and powerful bulls. He had grieved those lost to hunters or the slow cruelty of drought. In the safety zone, a protected area within the reserve where old or wounded animals could find rest and sanctuary, Makonde took special care to check on the older elephants. Many of them, with worn tusks and fading vision, would rumble softly when they saw his familiar silhouette approach. Some even reached out their trunks, brushing his chest gently, as if recognizing an old friend. In recent years, however, the Serengeti had grown harsh. Climate change had brought with it relentless heat waves and punishing droughts. Temperatures were now forecasted to climb as high as 45 degrees. The dry air shimmered like glass, and the earth cracked beneath the weight of sun. Even the zebras, lions, and giraffes now spent long hours huddled under trees or resting near shrinking waterholes. But on this particular morning, Makonde refused to stay in the shade. The day before, a call had come through the ranger's radio. A lone bull elephant had been spotted near the southern boundary of the reserve. It was limping, barely walking, and appeared to be suffering from a severe injury on its left hind leg. It had separated from its herd, a troubling sign for such a social creature. The young rangers had marked its location, but with nightfall approaching, they had left it to rest. Makonde couldn't stop thinking about it, so now, as the blazing sun climbed higher and heat waves rippled across the horizon, Makonde gripped the steering wheel tightly and began his journey south. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and dust billowed behind his tires like smoke. He knew the terrain like the lines of his own palms, but he also knew when an elephant isolates itself, the situation is always more urgent than it seems. And for Makonde, no distance was too far, no temperature too high when a life was in danger, especially not the life of an elephant. In the blazing morning heat, Makonde set off, crossing vast grasslands devoid of even the slightest shade. His destination was the area where an old elephant had been reported injured yesterday, a dense, desolate expanse of brush. This area was usually frequented by solitary males. He had encountered many complexities there in his youth. Now filled with anxiety, he traveled the same roads, only a little slower, a little quieter. His vehicle lurched across the cracked ground, the cabin heated like an oven, the heat seeping through the windows like fire. His shirt clung to his back, and beads of sweat dripped from his forehead. But for Makonde, the feeling was familiar. The warmth of this land had become his second skin. After a while, he reached a wide, dry, grassy clearing and stopped the vehicle. When he turned off the ignition and silenced the engine's hum, only the buzzing of a few flies and the distant chirping of a bird could be heard in the silence. He climbed out of his vehicle and squinted into the sun, peering toward the horizon. Beneath the shade, near a dusty tree, he saw a large mass lying motionless. Yes, there it was, an old male elephant. Its trunk was covered in soil, its ear twitching slightly, its breathing labored. The elephant had strayed from its herd a few days earlier. Makonde's heart froze as soon as he learned this. Elephants are rarely alone, and when they are either seriously injured or preparing to say goodbye. As he approached, A deep, festering wound on the elephant's leg caught his eye. He approached cautiously, his eyes open but weary. Makonde knelt and studied it for a moment, his eyes filled with compassion and a sadness he had known for years. At that moment, he felt a sharp pain in the center of his chest. The pain was so intense that it felt as if all the tiredness of the past, trapped between his ribs, had gathered there. His breath caught, his vision blurred. His heartbeat became unsteady. He crouched down, pressing his hand to his chest, then fell to his knees. Sweat no longer poured from his forehead, but from every inch of his body. His face paled, his lips trembling. At that moment, two young officers surveying the nearby zebra herd, Elijah and Musa, heard a muffled cry for help coming from the old man. At first, they thought it was a bird, but when they heard it again, they hurried back. Behind the bushes, they found Makonde curled up in the grass, breathing heavily. Elijah knelt down and checked his pulse. His heart was beating rapidly and erratically. Musa frantically opened his backpack, searching for the heart medication he always carried, but it was gone. Their eyes met. In that moment, they realized the old man had likely left home that morning, forgetting his medication. The situation was critical. Elijah grabbed his radio and sent a code message to the central station. Makonde has collapsed, pulse high and irregular. Ambulance needed. Urgent, he said, his voice trembling. Everyone at the center stopped what they were doing. The animals resting in the shade were silent, but the people were panicking. Something had changed that morning in the Serengeti. For the first time, a legend had had to call for help for himself. At that moment, the radio at the regional headquarters went silent. Shortly after the distress call arrived, a specialized medical off-road vehicle belonging to the Serengeti Reserve arrived, dust billowing from the undergrowth. The air was still stifling and hot, the earth still fiery and cracked. But the atmosphere inside the vehicle was even thicker than outside. Elijah, his head slightly bowed, gazed at Makonde's pale face, occasionally whispering his name. "Hold on. Makonde, father. You are older than this land. Don't go yet." But the old man's eyelids grew heavier and heavier. His breathing slowed, then became labored. Elijah panicked for a moment, grabbing his arm and shaking it gently. Musa, still wiping away his tears, yelled for the driver to speed up. It was still early morning when they arrived at the medical center, but the occupants were already ready. Makonde was carried on a stretcher to the emergency room. Time seemed to stand still. The room was small but well-equipped. The doctors quickly began CPR, and a nurse prepared the defibrillator. The device was connected, and a shock was administered with a fluttering sense of hope. The heart monitor was silent. Then another shock, and another. As the minutes passed, everyone's face paled. A few staff members gathered in the waiting room sat with their hands clasped in prayer. Makonde wasn't just a staff member. He was the living soul of the Serengeti. His voice rivaled the elephant's footsteps, and countless young rangers were guided by his knowledge. After exactly 17 minutes, a doctor slowly bowed his head. He removed his glasses, wiped them with the corner of his jacket, and spoke without making eye contact. His heart stopped a long time ago. He couldn't turn. In that moment, not a whisper lingered in the room. A timeless, frozen silence fell. Musa bowed his head. Elijah burst into tears. Even the walls surrounding the room seemed to stand in silence. The Serengeti had lost an elderly elephant the day before, and now the man who had protected him. The news quickly reached all the staff at the center. Some came running, others in their cars. All had the same expression: shock, disbelief, and profound grief. Makonde represented not only knowledge, but also resilience, devotion, and love. The reserve's strongest pillar had fallen, and nothing could replace it. When his family was informed, a tearful silence described the void he left behind. But Makonde's will had been clear long beforehand. "If I ever leave this land, leave me here. I want to sleep where my elephants look up to the Skiwakim." Respecting these words, reserve officials began preparing a ceremony in accordance with local traditions. Tribal elders were consulted, and ancient indigenous rituals were revisited. By unanimous decision, the ceremony would take place at the first light of the morning sun. The next morning, with the day still glowing in shades of gray, people gathered in the Serengeti's central courtyard. The surroundings were quiet. Only the muffled but melodic calls of elephants could be heard in the distance. A simple wooden bed had been set up in the middle of the courtyard, now ready for Makonde's final sleep. Makonde's body lay on the wooden bed, covered with a thin blanket. His face was peaceful, as if he had merely fallen asleep. Everyone who gazed upon his dead body felt both a deep pang of loss and a sense of gratitude mingled with admiration. The attendees approached him one by one. Some placed their hands on their hearts, some bowed their heads, and some prayed. Their eyes were filled with tears. When Elijah reached Makonde, his hands were trembling. He gently took the old man's hand. At that touch, memories of years spent together, morning patrols, emergency rescue missions, and conversations on stormy nights, resurfaced in his mind. "You are the one I learned everything from," he whispered quietly. Musa, however, quietly pulled a small incense from his pocket. He lit it according to tradition and knelt on the ground, beginning to pray. The wind gently dispersed the smoke around Makonde's body, taking on an almost mystical atmosphere. Just then, a deep, muffled sound echoed through the entire ceremonial grounds, coming from the reserve's massive main gate. A hum, then a boom. Everyone turned their heads, staring at the gate in panic. A massive figure appeared on the horizon, striding forward with heavy steps. Slowly emerging from the gray dust, it was an old male elephant, his massive ears listening to the air, his large tusks gleaming faintly. His trunk was imposing, his gait slow but determined. It was as if the earth knew him, yielding to him with every step. The crowd froze for a moment. Some retreated in fear, while a few tried to hide in the surrounding bushes. It was unusual for a lone male elephant to approach such a crowded area. But this elephant showed no anger or aggression. His eyes held a nobility, the silent weight of a past he carried within him. He passed through the crowd, harming no one. He looked at no one. He simply walked, slowly as if in mourning. He came straight to where the wooden bed was. He gently lowered his broad trunk to the ground. First circling the bed, the earth vibrated with each step. Then he stopped at the foot of the bed. He slowly bowed his head. He lowered his massive body to the ground as if kneeling. Slowly extending his trunk, he touched the edge of the bed. No one dared to breathe. There was sadness in his eyes, a look of remembering, of knowing, as if he had realized who the person lying there was. Elijah's eyes widened. A long diagonal scar on the elephant's left side caught his eye. Time stood still, for this scar opened a door to a memory that had remained lingering in his mind for years. "That's him," he whispered. "That's the elephant we saved 15 years ago." Elijah's voice trembled. Musa turned his head. "When the herd was ambushed by hunters, do you remember? Only one was alive. We sprung the trap." Yes, this male elephant, then young, had been horribly caught in a trap, his foot covered in blood. Makonde had approached him without fear, cut the trap with Elijah, then dressed the wound and waited for hours for it to heal. That day, before the elephant left, their eyes had met. That look was now being relived. And now that elephant had returned, for a thank you, a farewell, and perhaps a final salute of loyalty. Years ago, when that young male elephant was severely injured, nature's fate had left him to die. But Makonde hadn't. He might not have been able to carry him on his back, but he had shared his pain. He had stayed by his side for days, cleaning his wound every morning to prevent infection, carrying him water, preparing and feeding him leaf mixtures with his own hands. And finally, the elephant was recovered and released back into the wild. From that day to this, an unseen bond had been forged between them. Now, years later, the quiet arrival of this old elephant and his gesture at the ceremony shook the hearts of everyone present. In that moment, no animal or human in the Serengeti doubted this giant creature's intentions. He was here not for violence, but to bid farewell. Elijah walked slowly forward. His eyes were filled with tears, his hands trembling. But he was no longer timid. He stood before the elephant, their eyes locked. Elijah raised his hand slowly and touched the elephant's cheek, as if he were touching a friend. The massive creature bowed its head for a moment, then wrapped its trunk around Elijah's arm, as if wrapping it around his, lightly in a friendly gesture. A greeting, a remembrance, an acceptance. The people who had initially held back at this sacred scene gradually began to step forward. There was no fear anymore, only a shared grief, The aftermath of a legend remained. No one spoke. There was no need. Words were meaningless at that moment. When the ceremony was complete, the sun had begun to rise in the sky, but the warmth no longer came from the air alone, but from the emotion they carried within them. Makonde's body was placed on a stretcher. They would take him deep into the Serengeti to his favorite spot, the lush meadow where he always spent time with the elephants who came to rest. The SUV pulled away. People followed on foot. Some recited prayers, others remained silent. From behind came the old male elephant, walking slowly and solemnly, keeping pace with the group. As he walked, he would occasionally make a muffled sound, raising his trunk toward the sky and howling like a mournful howl. The Serengeti echoed. The birds fell silent. The wind stilled. That sound spoke volumes of the loss. Finally, they reached a lush, green, grassy area surrounded by large trees. This was where Makonde would come every morning to observe the old elephants, leaning back against a tree and closing his eyes. The shade was plentiful, the wind was light, and the scent of flowers permeated the earth. The grave was dug silently. With each stroke of the shovel, the earth seemed to sow. Then his body was carefully lowered, and an elephant tusk was placed beside him, a memento of one of the female elephants he had rescued years before, entrusted to Makonde after her natural death. The entire reserve was gathered in a crowded circle. Everyone was there: rangers, caretakers, locals, volunteers, and a lone elephant. The great creature came to the edge of the grave. It stood there for a moment. Then it lowered its trunk to the earth and struck it twice, perhaps a farewell, perhaps a thank you. Then he raised his head to the sky and called out once more. This time his voice was longer, more heartfelt, and deeper. It was as if he were saying, "I will not forget." And no one did. Elijah and Moses placed a heavy stone at the head of the grave. On it, in simple but meaningful letters, was inscribed, "Makonde, for 50 years, the voice, shadow, and conscience of this land." After the stone was placed, the local people arrived with flowers, incense, and prayers. The elder recited prayers in a low voice. The wind carried them across the Serengeti. "May his spirit shine as bright as the stars in the sky," someone said. "He has now returned to his ancestors." The old male elephant had stood right next to the grave the entire time. His massive head was still bowed. He never took his eyes off the small mound of earth. He was silent, but every posture was a promise, every breath a memory. Then, as the sky was painted with a crimson veil, the elephant lifted his head slightly. He stretched his trunk toward the sky and let out a deep, heartfelt cry that echoed throughout the Serengeti. It was neither a threat nor a call. It was a song of mourning for a lost friend. In that moment, even nature fell silent. The birds stopped singing, the leaves remained motionless. After this heartbreaking sound, the crowd slowly retreated. No one said anything. Words were inadequate. Only silence, respect, and a profound sense of loss remained. And of course, an old elephant, left alone. The sun slowly sank below the horizon. The Serengeti sky was blanketed in a crimson sadness. That image, the silhouette of an elephant, upright but broken, at the gravesite, was etched in the memories of everyone present. It was a sight that, even years later, still brings tears to the eyes when recounted, a memory that carries 1,000 words in its silence. The next day, the reserve suspended all its activities. Everyone observed a moment of silence in his memory. Staff, visitors, and volunteers came to the grave, burning incense, laying flowers, and offering prayers. The wind danced around the grave, and the birds waited silently in the branches. Everything seemed to sing a farewell song in his memory. And then, sometimes, that old elephant appeared again. He came quietly and sat down beside the grave. He would touch his trunk to the ground, then remain motionless for a long time. Sometimes he would close his eyes. Sometimes he would look up at the sky, but he never made a sound. Anyone who experienced that moment knew this wasn't just an animal. This was the silent visitation of a spirit that never forgot gratitude. Makonde had breathed hope into this elephant's life. And now, to make him unforgettable, the elephant offered a loyalty that raced against time with each visit. Elijah and Musa would also come frequently and talk at the graveside. They would share their memories, recount current events, and vow to carry on his legacy. They were no longer alone. Makonde's spirit lived on in every tree, every animal, and every memory of the Serengeti. And so, the story of the legendary ranger Makonde lived on in the heart of Tanzania's Serengeti Reserve, just like the loyalty of that elephant who never said goodbye. Dear friends, thank you for watching this moving story until the end. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. See you soon. Hope to see you again in the next episode.